Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Csaba.
And we have Patrick Dunphy joining us today. Patrick is somebody that I used to work with a long time ago, and he has gotten into the accessibility field, which is of great interest to both Csaba and I, and to our listeners, because it's something that we've often struggled with. So, Patrick, welcome, and let's get right into it. So, first, just tell us what you've been up to for the last couple of years in the accessibility field. And second part, how did you get into accessibility? Because we don't find a lot of people who actually go into this field and know it deeply. People kind of go into front-end development and they become something else. What interested you about this field? And so, and how you got into it? So two-part, what you've been up to for the last couple of years, and how did you actually enter this field?
Gotcha. Okay. So for the last couple of years, a little over 2 years, I've been working for Dayforce. I'm wearing here on the hat. It's a HCM software company, and basically offering the full suite of HR software, like benefits management, recruitment, payroll, HR, all of those specific functions. So for our enterprise customers, and every enterprise has accessibility needs. So I saw an opportunity to make a difference for that type of platform, that industry. Quite frankly, every company has accessibility requirements, whether they recognize it or not. I got into accessibility kind of by accident, to be honest. I've come to realize that I myself have some hidden disabilities just through education and by living it. I mean, I wear glasses. I mean, that's a very simple example of assistive technology. But I was working for an ad agency in the late 2000s, where I worked for a major U.S. bank. And as I was the first developer put on that account, they said, "Hey, if you're going to work with us, you need to understand accessibility." And at the time, I was like, "What is it?" I did some training. I went to Utah for a company called WebAIM, a nonprofit called WebAIM. They are in Utah State University, and there was like a 3-day immersive workshop on accessibility, where for the first time, I actually got to interact with somebody with a disability, different people with disabilities, and really understand the impact that it has. And what that made me realize is that I've been surrounded by persons that have been impacted by various disabilities my entire life. Growing up, I had a family friend who became a quadriplegic as a result of a motorcycle accident. I had deaf mute cousins who, when I was a kid, it was the coolest house in the world to go to, because when the phone rang, the lights would flash and the teletypewriter would start going off. And whereas kids were like, "And this is really cool," right? And I also have a legally blind uncle who was a journalist back in Newfoundland, where I'm originally from. So that made me realize that this is important. It's been part of my life, whether I recognize it or not. And it's in software development circles, it's heavily underserved. So it's admittedly a niche, but not so niche anymore in the advent of COVID. COVID made everything remote real, and made the realization of accessing content, accessing platforms, accessing software. Everything needs to be usable, not just in person, but also remotely as well. And that was really, I think that was a tipping point for the accessibility industry. There has been there's a professional designation for accessibility now. That industry, that certification body is 10 years old as of this year. That's called the IAAP, Internet Association of Accessibility Professionals. It's underserved, it's important, and it's roughly 1 in 4 in the population.
So, one of the things that, I'm a novice when it comes to this stuff. As a developer, I just make sure I have ARIA tags on, like that kind of stuff. But one, this meme that I once saw, or this graphic that I once saw, was that, somebody who just went to an eye appointment and has eye drops, there's somebody that I never thought of, somebody with a disability. It's temporary, but it's there. Or you hurt your arm. You can't open a door. You got to use a computer. That's accessibility. So that really changed my view on accessibility, because I always associated incorrectly with somebody who has a permanent disability. But then you realize sort of that, oh my God, this impacts me as well.
Exactly.
Are there sort of like, when did you realize that it's not just about disabled people as we traditionally think of them, but it actually applies to us as well? Like you, me, and Csaba are equally impacted by these things.
Exactly. If you are addressing the people that are marginalized, you're making things better for everybody. What you're talking about is the permanent, situational, temporary disability paradigm, and Microsoft has an inclusive design toolkit that really does a good job of digging into that and highlighting what that means. And you provide two very good examples of permanent and situational disabilities. Anybody who, if you're in a bar, for example, you're watching a basketball game, I know, Zarar, you're a huge basketball fan, closed captionings. I mean, that's an assistive technology. It's just very common and omnipresent. When did I realize that? That's a tough question. I don't know what the aha moment was, other than, as I said, like the one of the first interactions I had with somebody about technology. He said, "Don't tell me who you are. Give me your name tag." And he was using an old Symbian phone. Scanned it. Say, "Hey, Patrick, how you doing?" And my mind was blown right at that point in time. Right, and then I was like, "Okay, there's way more to this than I expected." We're all going to be disabled at some point in time. As we age, our eyesight goes, our hearing goes, our dexterity and manual dexterity lessens. So accessibility is really a way to address the needs for your future self. And a common example in the accessibility space is the curb cut effect. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
No, please.
Okay, so the curb cut effect is, so if you're city planning, whatever, you're creating sidewalks. The curb cut, it was designed for people with wheelchairs to be able to access the curb and facilitate quick access, but you're pushing a stroller, delivery drivers with hand trucks, with deliveries, that type of stuff. It is something that is universally usable for everybody, and it's just part of the environment. It enables so much more than just the use case of accessibility.
Csaba?
Yeah, it's so you mentioned these that you came to this realization. I'm pretty sure that in your work life, especially being developer, you see gaps continuously. What are these biggest gaps? Like, what are the most glaring gaps that you are aware that you want to call out?
The largest gap is probably the lack of education about accessible development. That is a significant contributing factor. I'm not aware of many post-secondary institutions that include accessibility in their curriculum. There's another organization called Teach Access that is looking to fill that gap, and they are working with various post-secondaries to treat. And it's teaching the basics, really, and it's understanding semantic meaning for the markup. I know React, Angular, they're all the you compile the rendered UI, but really it's the rendered UI of what somebody is interacting with. And when I say interacting with, I mean I use a mouse, I use my keyboard, but that's not assistive technology. That is not a screen reader. So a screen reader needs to interpret the UI in order to relay that information to the user, so they can understand what this thing is and what does it do. So it's the fundamental the fundamental building blocks of HTML. The HTML specification was designed intentfully, with purpose. A button is a button. A div is a semantically meaningless element, but with the magic of JavaScript and CSS, you can create anything you want, and that lacks meaning. So you have to provide that meaning if you are not building to semantics. And Zarar, you mentioned ARIA earlier, and that's why ARIA was created, because there are patterns that have been popularized that do not have the semantic element that exists. Like there is no modal tag, for example. Like you have to create an ARIA a role that informs assistive technology. Hey, this is a modal element that exists on screen, or a tooltip, things of that nature that don't have a native meaning in the HTML in the HTML spec.
Yeah. So you used to be a front-end developer, so you know this really well. I have found that, as with the advent of basically JavaScript injected into everything now,
Mm-hmm.
HTML is almost like a sidecar. like it's something that is almost incidental more than the central figure. But I don't know if, how much you're following the space, but I have seen almost a return to the past, where now, Next.js is a great example. Elixir's Phoenix Live View is another example. And recently I was playing with OneStack.dev, which is another example, where we're sort of going back to rendering HTML on the server side. And when during interaction, we're not passing JSON payloads back and forth, we're actually passing HTML back and forth over the wire, which obviously is easier to sort of like make more accessible. So have you noticed this shift of like sort of what's old is new again in some way? Because I certainly have caught on to it a little bit.
I honestly, I have not. I've been consumed by React in my current role and my last two, I will say. But it's encouraging to hear. I mean, if we are returning to the basics, we are returning to rendered markup. That's better for performance. It's better for semantics. It's better for the user, because the markup is simpler. It's easier to understand, and that abstraction layer of the accessibility object model. So the accessibility tree renders, so HTML output, like, so you have your heading tags, you have your divs. The accessibility tree interprets the DOM, the markup, and gives roles and properties. And that is what an assistive technology relies on to inform them what the UI is doing. So if it is a return to those basics, I welcome it, because the so-called modern frameworks of probably not so modern anymore, take that level of thinking out of the equation, and that's done a disservice specifically for accessibility.
Mm-hmm. Like we talk a lot about shift left on this podcast, right? How do we test early? How do we identify defects early? And with accessibility, I just realized that it's almost like you have to sort of shift the technology to an older technology to get it to work well. But let me just switch a little topics to teams. So you work with many teams. You yourself are a developer. What are some patterns that you see present, or maybe culture-wise or technology-wise, on teams that do care about accessibility and build accessible products right from the get-go, and they don't go through the cycle where you create a product and somebody else comes in, usually an accessibility tester, which is somebody else entirely, files, 200 defects, of which 10 get fixed and 190 are backlogged. So what's the remedy to that? And in your answer, just talk, you can talk about technology, but you can talk about culture, team setup. How do you actually address that problem, which is prevalent across the board?
So you mentioned shift left, and to be successful with accessibility, shift left is essential to that. The earlier that you are considering accessibility in the ideation phase, in the wireframe phase, in the composite, creating the acceptance criteria for the different components you want to use. If you are embedding accessibility into each of those, you're annotating your designs, your wireframes, your acceptance criteria ensures that you are capturing what is the keyboard interactions. The sooner that you are thinking about those, the better. Your research feeds into it, your design feeds into it, your developer feeds into it, the QA feeds into it. So the earlier that you are addressing accessibility in your workflow, the less cost you are going to have on the delivery. Because the later that you find a bug, like to your point, the later that you find a bug in the software development lifecycle, the more expensive it is to fix. And if you are fixing something that's already gone into production for accessibility, it's highly expensive. And then there are studies, if you were to Google the cost of accessibility defects in the software development lifecycle, you will find some interesting results.
So I want to stay a little bit with development and developers. I remember when I started development, I learned Java, some JSP, some JDBC, and boom, I was off go, was building applications.
Yeah.
Nowadays, a beginner developer, I can't even count how many frameworks and technologies, and now, of course, DevOps and full stack, and I could go security, I could go on and on. So now we put on the top of it accessibility, of course, because if you are a full stack developer, that would be something that would be desired you to know and learn. what would be the MVP or the minimum viable accessibility knowledge, in your opinion, that a beginner developer should learn or acquire, just enough that to be able to get started and start building?
Understood.
What would be like resources, if you want, list resources, technologies, whatever you would think that because you mentioned that there's not really taught, so that's why I'm asking this question.
Yeah, accessibility is not considered to be sexy in the way you're talking about development frameworks in the advent. So it's kind of been neglected, and it's understanding the basic building blocks of the UI that you're doing. So my advice for a developer would be, any UI that you are building, make sure that you are using your keyboard the entire time to try and use that application, just as a very first start. Because you're being able to use the UIs that you're building with the keyboard alone, that's your gateway to assistive technology, to ensure that you are registering the clicks and the button presses for. So that would be that's essential to be successful. The thing is, when it comes to assistive technology, we don't know what people are using. We don't. There is the ability to detect, but that's more upon the application side, like mobile development, mobile application development. But there's a very important privacy matter to call out. I shouldn't have to disclose that I have a disability and that I need to use a screen reader in order to use your product or service or application. So that would be my advice: is, can you use your keyboard? Do you know where you are on screen at all times? That would be the second thing I would add, like making sure that you have distinct visual focus state changes, being able to follow your user flow, your user paths within there. So keyboard operability, distinct visual focus change for people with low vision as well. And everybody automatically gravitates towards screen reader when it comes to accessibility, because that is the most tangible thing people can think of. I can't see a UI, therefore I need to use a screen reader. But not all screen reader users are non-visual either. I mean, you have people with cognitive disabilities. I know of dyslexic users that use screen readers in order to read the screen to them properly. So you can't have assumptions about who is using your the thing that you're building.
That's actually a good one, because it's funny that you mentioned the curve effect. Because I started using computer encoding without mouse at the time. We just had like DOS, and I'm a very keyboard centric person. So even when I'm on the internet, I'm filling out a form, I'm still using like typing tab. This is like an old habit. And you wouldn't believe how many times I'm on websites where tab doesn't go where I would expect to go. And so this is not even accessibility. This is just like
practice.
Exactly. So some people, just to be able to get efficiently through that form without needing to reach for a mouse, reach for the thing. So I can totally relate to that, because it's mind-boggling sometimes how come not even this basic functionality is built into websites.
Exactly. And when it comes to the keyboard access, like the other thing is understanding, as a developer, the rendered output. Are you producing the thing that the most appropriate element for the job? We mentioned ARIA already. That the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA when it comes to accessibility, right? So it's kind of odd. Yeah. So the first rule: don't use ARIA if there is a semantically equivalent element for that, right? And that's what the HTML specification is. We want to make sure that we are using input fields appropriately. We've seen JavaScript create a div and make it editable, and all this. Hey, this is really cool. But what you're doing, you're developing for yourself. You're stroking your own ego by trying to make it work that way, when you're not really always considering the end user and the different use cases of how it's going to be interpreted.
Yeah, I mean, it really puts a new light on customer centricity, because we sort of assume we have this like image of the customer. Yeah. And of course, they're going to love it once they like click and edit, and it'll be content editable. But in reality, now, also, as Csaba said, it's also just faster if you don't do those gymnastics and you just render a regular text box and you do the basic simple thing.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily need to have like a drop down which automatically does all kinds of things and adds tags to it. You can do things in a simpler way, and it's going to save you development effort. It's going to save you maintenance effort, And I think it's going to be more usable at the end of the day.
Exactly. It's the concept of progressive enhancing of your UI and layering functionality as you build up from the basics. That's the appropriate way for accessible development. Um, One thing that I have not yet mentioned, and I do want to call out, is that while we are like as developers, we are building what we think is appropriate, we still require validation by the community. And when I say the community, it's the users with disabilities, that to make sure that they can actually use the things that we are building for everybody. So you want to include them into the process, into the validation, into the testing process. There are companies that specialize in that. There's one here in Toronto called Fable Labs that allow companies to hire Fable, bring them on board, and what they do, they enable interviewing, testing of the applications to ensure that the PWD community, persons with disability community, are also included as well. So these are user interviews, so you can share a design with them, talk them through it. You can submit in a testing environment. You can give them test cases to user flows. Well, they will give you feedback from screen reader users, screen magnification users, or non-pointing device users, a keyboard-only user, for example. Right. So these are it's an important service. And it's important to include that community as well.
I kind of want to switch to team structures a little bit.
Yeah.
And the Amazon sort of made famous the 2 pizza team, like 8 developers basically per team. And we've worked with teams which have like QA, and sometimes accessibility, as I mentioned earlier, is almost a separate entity. Like what have you seen in practice on how to structure a team which keeps accessibility first, or keeps it at least a front and center concern, and not sort of outsources it to a separate party? I know you mentioned like developer knowledge and bringing that in. Like is that the primary advice that you would give somebody who's like organizing a team, to get the developers to know this? And if that's not possible, or maybe that's not, so beyond just that, what else can we do to organize and make sure accessibility is a concern for teams? Like, how do you organize teams so that they care about this stuff?
Okay. There's a couple ways to handle this. So you can embed accessibility expertise within the team. But that's not really scalable, like to have an accessibility specialist or a subject matter expert on every team. So accessibility, talking about shift left, accessibility is everybody's responsibility. The team, for what they are producing, are ultimately responsible for producing accessibility. So all developers should have some level of knowledge of accessibility. We all learn at different paces. We all have different degrees of exposure to this. And the fact is, within development circles, you haven't dealt with accessibility until you've had to deal with it, right? So it's not something that people have. Companies that do accessibility well have accessibility dedicated teams that are an enablement function. So the expectation for different teams, different products, to ship their own accessible features, but they don't know what they don't know sometimes as well, which is why a specialist function for accessibility is important, in order to unblock and enable these teams to produce accessible code that can be that can be tested, that is usable by persons with disabilities. That would probably be the most successful model, I think, and that's what we do here at Dayforce. We have an enablement team. When I originally joined the organization, it was accessibility was very much a remediation practice. So we have a third party that we use for auditing, and they produce a list of defects and that we have to address. To your point, some get addressed, some live in the backlog. But while you are addressing remediation efforts, net new work doesn't stop. Right. So you want to make sure that you have coverage for the new work that's happening, as well as you are fixing existing defects, so you aren't increasing the tech debt that accessibility introduces. So it needs to be integrated. Product managers need to integrate it into the user stories, making sure that we're creating acceptance criteria. Developers need to be able to understand that, and testers need to be able to validate that. Now, in the world of Agile, manual QA is depending on the organization that you're in. So there has to be some degree of competence or understanding what needs to be done. My advice that I give to people first encountering accessibility is to accept that you don't know, because that's okay. We all learn at different paces and we all have different understandings of what accessibility means. If you're unsure what the question is, that's the time to engage us. Because hey, I know I have this thing. I know I need to address accessibility. That's when you engage us and we talk through what you're trying to develop and trying to build, and we can get very specific into the micro elements within the UI, or we can talk about the application in full. It all depends on what is being built. So it's kind of a rambling answer, but it's a generalist type practice. We'll say you are a jack of all, master of none when it comes to accessible. Well, you're a master of accessibility. I should correct myself there, but accessibility professionals like myself, I mean, we don't know it all. I mean, we are constantly evolving our own understanding of what accessibility means. Like, what's the impact of AI in accessibility? Right? I mean, that's a very emerging practice, an emerging field. What are the impacts for person with disabilities? What are the ethics? What are the ethical considerations? Like, how, as a person with disability, how am I going to be impacted by accessibility? Am I going to continue to be marginalized, or am I going to be included? Right. So it's an emerging thing. And it's like anything else. It will constantly evolve. The needs will change, and we need to adapt to those needs.
I remember my first time when accessibility, I encountered it. We had a client project and AODA came in. You're probably familiar with AODA. Mm-hmm. This is the help me with the acronym Accessibility,
or Ontarians with Disabilities Act.
Yes, Ontario Disabilities Act.
Yeah, it was actually, and that's the first legislation that impacted the public and private sector in the world.
So I remember the struggle we had, because we had I think the A and the AA, and then these kind of qualified kind of what need to happen. Mm-hmm. Those listeners who probably work in this probably understand what I'm talking about. But what I found, it was almost impossible to fulfill those, or almost impossible to fulfill a large extent of those. So to Zarar's point, like 10% of them got addressed, and then the rest 99% stayed in the backlog. How practical is AODA? How practical to follow these legislations? Like again, what is your advice on how we thread that needle? That we need to provide these, so solve real problems for the people who need this. But yet we have this legislation, which is always legislations. They have the good intent, but it for me it seemed very, very, very overbearing and exhausting.
It's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of work. Trying to make sure the text is read at the right location. You're right. You before you ask the question, I know that no matter how much clean code you try to write, you end up writing a lot more code, again, with the modern web frameworks, just to get something working. If this was as simple as HTML, it would be dead simple. But because of our technology stack, what Csaba is saying is bang on, because it may take you, like, I don't know, 5 days to develop a feature and 4 days to make it accessible. Now, I'm exaggerating here, but I think the point is well made.
Yeah, and the standards exist and the legislation exists, so people are included. Like, it's a necessary evil, to be quite frank. So backing up, the AODA is requires the web content accessibility guidelines. The standard is 2.1 AA. Or 2.0 when it was introduced, 2.0 AA, and what that means is level A, level AA, and level AAA. Like, if you are satisfying those requirements, you are including more and more people. So if you're addressing A, you are including a certain subset because you are addressing those. The numbers escape me right now, but it's based on 4 principles, 13 guidelines, and 62 success criteria. A is probably like 20% of that, right? So I mean, just by virtue of saying those numbers, it gives you an idea of how complicated the specification itself can be. And that's necessary. They're the working groups that created the specification. There wasn't any specific practice or person driving the bus. I mean, it was higher education, big business, and persons with disabilities collaborating together to create these specifications so it was meaningful. It wasn't just, hey, I'm the first one out the door and I'm creating the specification, so therefore the industry needs to adopt it, right? So it was done with intent, and it was done with mindfulness. And what's important about the WCAG specification, regardless of it being 2.0, 2.1, AA, AAA, is the principles that it represents. Content needs to be perceivable, content needs to be operable, content needs to be understandable, and it needs to be robust enough so you can consume it on different devices. I remember the advent of the iPhone when it came out in the late 2000s. Nobody had seen a touchscreen before. As a blind user using a visual touchscreen, it's kind of that concept was kind of wow. But because it was built to a robust nature, it could be used, but by the screener, the iOS voiceover screen reader that was built into the operating system of the touchscreen devices. So that's why that standard exists. So the essentially what was built was future-proofed, so it could be accessed. How you distill that down? If you're an insomniac and you need to sleep, go read the specification. It's dense, it's large, it's not very user friendly, and that's my job to interpret that. It's not every developer's job to interpret that. That's why I speak to an enablement team or an accessibility specialist function. They are the subject matter experts that teams need to rely on in order to ensure that they are getting it right. So there are subsets of information that can be distilled from the standard itself for grouping, making sure that there's related things for visual, there's related things for keyboard operability, and that's how I would approach that. Is you have subject matter expertise. You need to sprinkle accessibility knowledge into your teams, because this is a continuous delivery podcast. This is a continuous learning practice. That's what accessibility is. You don't need to know everything, but you should have a sense of something. And there's a useful quote that I use internally a lot. And it's kind of funny. It's a Donald Rumsfeld quote from yeah, I know, right? So
of all the people,
of all the people, right? So and it's talking about the Iraq War years ago, right? There are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. That encapsulates accessibility perfectly, right? It's and just bring up that 2x2 grid, and that really brings up that talks about accessibility, illustrates the problem of it. It is a practice that it's shades of gray in a world that wants black and white. Yeah. Right. That's another way to put it.
Yeah. Stay tuned. We got a Dick Cheney quote coming up later on. It's a war criminal podcast today.
Sorry about that, but it's an appropriate one.
It's timely. It's actually timely. Yeah. The one that I submitted an app to the App Store the other day for jumpcomedy.com, plug here. And I got grilled in the submission on like privacy, security, account deletion, like 8 submissions back and forth. Mm-hmm. Not a single comment about accessibility, not a single one. And my app is not accessible. It's just like thrown out there to do whatever. But then I realized that Apple itself has actually some good OS level accessibility tools. Like if you turn on Apple's accessibility, whatever, that little icon, yep, it does a pretty thorough job of like going through the app. So I'm wondering, like, do you think we're going to a place where maybe the responsibility of accessibility gets shifted up at the OS level, where maybe it's like, I'm just pie in the sky here, right? Yep. Maybe it's like, because we're developing against, say, Windows or iOS or Android, and at the OS level, these things are taken care of, and maybe they'll be taken care of better at that level than every individual developer making every individual app having to worry about it. Am I dreaming here, or what do you see in that case?
The large companies that you just referred to, like Apple, Google or Alphabet, whatever you want to call them, and Microsoft. I mean, they are doing very good jobs of incorporating accessibility into the operating systems. So if accessibility is built properly, it just works, right? Apple specifically, like accessibility is part of their core culture, and they like Super Bowl commercial. They have accessibility. Apple highlights accessibility in their Super Bowl ads, and it is a core company component, and they're doing it right, really, quite frankly. With the different applications that they build, the different products that they are shipping. Microsoft as well, like they have. I talked about the inclusive design toolkit, but they also have high level oversight to the different product suites they have. The Microsoft Adaptive Controller was a groundbreaking application that freed up gaming for persons with disabilities. And that's probably, I want to say it's about probably a little bit older than that right now, but that was revolutionary for, I'm a person with severe motor disabilities, but I can compete with my brother who is able-bodied and has no disabilities as well. It leveled the playing field for persons with disabilities and just including them. So the large players have a responsibility, quite frankly, to ensure that their operating systems, the platforms that they are providing, that they address accessibility so that we can build on top of it and use these systems.
Oh, absolutely. I agree, and I think a lot of stuff that now that has come to be like normal has come from big companies. Like you mentioned React earlier, that's a Facebook product that came from there. Like Android came from Google. Like these are all things that start off with quote unquote big tech. So like we haven't even talked about augmented reality and how it can help us in the future. So, but I know we're sort of at time. So Patrick, I want to thank you for coming on and giving us a really strong overview of like what the industry looks like and what we can do to make better products. Appreciate you coming on. Thanks again, man.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about accessibility. Anybody who knows me in the professional world, I'm always happy to talk about accessibility. It's underserved, it's important, and it's quality. Really, is what it speaks to. If you're incorporating accessibility, you are producing quality, sustainable products. And I appreciate the invite. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, and happy to address any questions now or in the future.
Okay, that's awesome, man. That's a perfect way to end it. Accessibility is quality. I think that's our learning for today. Thanks, Patrick.